Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Australian Institute of Criminology. My name is Mathew Lyneham and I'm a researcher in the Crime and Populations team here. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. It's also important to acknowledge that what I'm going to be talking to you about today are cases of persons who have died in custody. Before I begin, I would like to offer my sincerest condolences to the families and friends of all those persons who have died in custody. The ongoing monitoring of deaths in custody remains an important process to ensure that every effort is made to reduce the numbers of persons dying in custody each year. The National Deaths in Custody Monitoring Program is responsible for monitoring the extent and nature of deaths that have occurred in prison, police and juvenile custody since 1980. The Australian Institute of Criminology has coordinated the National Deaths in Custody Monitoring Program since 1992, which was established following the recommendation from the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody the previous year. The program is unique in that no other country has consistently collected similar data over such a long period of time. And the purpose of monitoring deaths in custody is to provide accurate, regular information that will contribute to policies and programs that aim to reduce deaths in custody and to increase public understanding of the issues. Data are provided by the relevant custodial authority, usually within a matter of days after the death occurred. Now, there are a number of points you need to consider with the National Deaths in Custody Monitoring Program. Whenever a person dies whilst under the supervision of a custodial authority, not only is it a matter for serious concern, but it raises a number of important questions. Namely, what were the circumstances that led to a person dying in custody? What was the cause of death? Who was responsible? And what could be done better in the future? The Deaths in Custody program collects information that assists in answering such questions and serves as an ongoing accountability and performance measure for custodial authorities. It also identifies emerging trends and issues regarding deaths in custody. Moving now to findings from the most recent 2008 study, we can see that nationally there were 86 deaths occurring in prison and police custody. 54 occurred in prison custody, 9 of which were Indigenous. 32 deaths occurred in police custody and police custody related operations, 4 involving Indigenous persons. There were also 10 deaths in prison custody due to hanging, none involving an Indigenous person, and there was 1 hanging death in police custody. In 2008, there were 11 deaths occurring in motor vehicle pursuits, 1 involving an Indigenous person, and finally 14 deaths resulted from police shootings during custody-related operations. So in total there were 13 Indigenous deaths in custody in 2008, 9 in prison and 4 in police custody. All of the Indigenous prison custody deaths were attributed to natural causes, and for police custody, 1 death was each recorded in natural causes, external multiple trauma, gunshot and other. Now importantly, when we look closely at this data, we can see that the rates of death in prison was lower for Indigenous at 1.3 per thousand prisoners than for non-Indigenous at 2.2 per thousand. And rates have been declining for both groups since the 1990s. Unfortunately, it's not possible to calculate rates for police custody due to a lack of data on the number of custody incidents each year. We can see that older persons, generally over 40 years, were more likely to die in prison, whilst younger persons under 40 were more likely to die in police custody. Looking now at some longer-term trends, we can see that since 1980, a total of 2,056 deaths in custody have occurred. 1,260 of these occurred in prison and 779 in police custody and related operations. A further 17 have been recorded in juvenile detention centres. Now, between 1996 and 2006, the rate per thousand prisoners was trending downward, with an overall decrease of around 40% over that decade. However, since 2006, there's been some upward movement in the trend, from 55 total deaths in 2006 to 74 in 2007 and now we see 86 in 2008. Looking at a graphical representation of this model now, we can see that it spiked in the mid-1990s and has since been declining each year since. However, in recent years, we've seen some modest rises, particularly in prison custody. Now, this increase in the rate can be largely attributed to recent increases in the number of both 40 to 54-year-olds and persons over 55 years dying in prison custody. The number of 40 to 54-year-olds dying in prison has increased by 67% in the last couple of years. And the same can be seen for persons over 55 years dying in custody, which have increased 58%. In 2008, interestingly, both the number of 55-year-olds and over dying in prison and the number of natural cause deaths in prison were the highest ever recorded since the collection of this data began in 1980. Now, this trend is primarily associated with an ageing prisoner population in Australia. The percentage of prisoners aged over 55 years in 1987 was 2.2%. This rose to 3.8% a decade later and has further increased to 6.2% in 2008. Also, we can see that ABS data shows the median age of the prisoner population in Australia has risen by approximately 5 years, most particularly amongst the non-Indigenous cohort. Looking now to hanging deaths in prison, we can see that over the 20-year period from 1980 to 2000, hanging deaths were generally outnumbered all other causes of death in prison each year. There have been a total of 494 hanging deaths in prison since 1980. However, since 2000, the number of hanging deaths in prison has been declining, while natural cause deaths have overtaken as the most numerous each year. Reductions in hanging deaths can partly be attributed to efforts to reduce hanging points in prison cells throughout Australia. An initiative was informed by the National Deaths in Custody Monitoring Program. Data has also been collected on hanging points and materials used in hangings since 1990. For the 340 cases where information is available, cell bars accounted for 39% of hanging points, other fittings 36%, and shower fixtures 13%. 2 out of every 3 hanging deaths, the material used is almost always bed sheets. If we move now to a graphical representation of prison hanging deaths between 1980 and 2008 by the cause of death, we can see that this rise in natural cause deaths is quite apparent. From 2002 onwards, natural cause deaths in prison are quite clearly well above all other causes of death. While similarly, external and multiple trauma, drugs and alcohol, and deaths due to hanging have been on the decline. The National Deaths in Custody Monitoring Program also collects information on the most serious offence leading to custody. These offences are grouped into 6 broad categories: violent offences, theft-related offences, drug-related, traffic, good order, and other. Now, 35% of the 54 prison deaths in 2008 were of persons whose most serious offence prior to custody was violent in nature. Now, this finding correlates with ABS data, which shows that roughly 52% of the Australian prisoner population were imprisoned for violent offences. Looking at this trend, it can be seen that rates of death amongst persons with violent offences as their most serious have been relatively constant since the early 1980s, whilst theft and drug-related have been declining, particularly over the last decade. We can see here in this graph that violent offences have started to rise over the last 5 to 10 years, whilst at the same time the other five categories have been declining. Importantly, we can see that drug, traffic and good order related offences are low to none each year. If we move now to deaths in police custody, in 1994 the definition of a death in police custody was expanded to include those occurring during police custody related operations. There are 2 types of police custody deaths. Category 1, which is those occurring in institutional settings, police raids and shootings, and then Category 2, which is sieges and motor vehicle pursuits. Between 1990 and 1999, Category 1 deaths were generally more numerous each year than Category 2. However, since 2000, Category 2 deaths have become the most common type of police custody death each year. So they're the ones in sieges and motor vehicle pursuits. Looking now at a graph of this trend, we can see that deaths in police custody have peaked in the early part of this decade but have since been declining. More importantly, however, is the decline in Category 1 deaths, particularly in the late 1990s and early part of this decade. At the same time, Category 2 deaths, those occurring in sieges and motor vehicle pursuits, they've been on the rise slightly. So in 2008, there were 32 deaths in police custody and related operations, and this represents a small increase from 2007. There were 4 deaths of Indigenous persons in police custody in 2008. Now, of these 32 deaths, 11 were due to external multiple trauma, generally as a result of a motor vehicle pursuit accident, and 14 were due to gunshot injuries, and they're either self-inflicted or shoot by police. 27 of the 32 deaths occurred while police were in the process of detaining or attempting to detain an individual. And of these 27, 14 were the result of a shooting, and 11 occurred during motor vehicle pursuits. Now, shooting deaths occur when a person is shot by police or where a person shoots themselves in the presence of police. Now, since 1990, there's been a total of 165 shooting deaths. The number of deaths of persons shot by police has decreased marginally since 1990, while self-inflicted shooting deaths have remained fairly stable over the same period. Since 1990, 71 of the total 165 shooting deaths, 43%, have involved people who have shot themselves in the presence of police. And this raises questions around suicide and other mental health issues, and they need consideration if self-inflicted shooting deaths are to be reduced. We see a breakdown of these shooting deaths by Indigenous status. Non-Indigenous persons make up the overwhelming majority of persons involved in police shootings. Deaths of Indigenous persons in police operations occur very infrequently,